A very warm welcome to this final session of the annual meeting of Global Future Councils. This marks the end of this meeting, but it really marks the beginning of this 2-year term of the Global Future Councils. And in some ways, we could say it also marks an inflection point when we look at the wider international context. Professor Schwab, when he opened this meeting yesterday, talked about the fact that globalization is not the problem is a lack of global governance. And then in the evening, Nairi Woods in the plenary on responsive and responsible leadership built on that, saying that globalization needs to mean global responsibilities. Responsibilities, one could say, for a future that is more inclusive, that is more participatory, and more sustainable. And in a way, that's the mandate you are committed to in your respective councils. Now, we looked in these discussions over the past 2 days at the role of technology, the role that technology can play with a theory to improve the performance of our systems in terms of these imperatives. Now, we have a wonderful panel to give us a sense of synthesis after these 2 initial days, and also a direction for the road ahead. We have the CEO of Infosys, Vishal Sikka, who serves as the co-chair of our Council on Artificial Intelligence and Robotics, Usha Rao-Monari, the CEO of Global Water Development Partners, the co-chair of our Council on the Future of Environment and Resource Security, Kochi, the co-founder of UNICEF Innovation, and co-chair of our Council on the Future of Human Rights. And finally, Tim Dixon, Managing Director for Purpose and part of our Council on the Future of Platforms and Systems. Now, before I turn to the panel, I'd like to hear from some of you involved in the discussions we had earlier today on the impact of technology, the transformative impact of some of these technologies on our systems. And I know, Banerjee, you were leading some of the most active discussions on artificial intelligence, 3D printing. What was your main takeaway from these discussions? Very briefly.
Should I just shout?
You have a microphone just here.
Okay. Very vibrant session, very well attended. And I think we looked at both the positive and the negative sides, the potential positive sides and the negative sides. And some larger themes that came up was that in the kind of leadership that we need in the future, the time horizon would be very different, very dynamic, very agile. Also, some of these fourth industrial revolution technologies would lead to a disruption of the current business models, but make way for completely new kinds of business models, but also a great promise on circular economies, and also looking at inclusion of people who are not included now, but it would also require a whole lot of regulatory and ethical frames and also standards that are much more dynamic than we have right now to keep pace with the rapid change.
Thank you. Justine, was that in your discussions this point on a rather positive outlook on the role of technology enabling these imperatives that we talked about inclusion, participation, and sustainability? Would you echo that in your discussions?
Our discussion was somewhat different. So I was lucky enough to facilitate 2 panels, one on neurotechnology and one on quantum computing. So neurotechnology is anything that senses or stimulates the brain. And it turns out, we learned that something as simple as a meditation app on a mobile phone can change the brain because the brain is plastic. Quantum computing uses the fundamental laws of physics, in particular the fact, and I'm sure you've wanted to know this because I've wanted to know this forever, what is quantum computing? The fact that a particle can be in 2 states at the same time, and that 2 particles can be inextricably linked, that fundamental law of physics is used for computation rather than our ones and zeros. We have a lot more values to play with. So we talked about the risks and the benefits and those who aren't even included in the conversation. And we focused on how to make sure that society benefits rather than suffers from these two future-oriented technologies. What I was most struck by was a tension between what I would call top-down governance-oriented solutions and bottom-up responsibility-oriented solutions. So top-down governance often by governments or other regulatory organizations, and bottom-up responsibility often by technologists and everyday citizens. And I think that's a tension that I see in a lot of our conversations, not just in the future of computing, but in many of the ways we think about the future. Are we going to need to regulate, or are we going to have an involved and civic-minded citizenry? So I think I would sum it up. Andrew Firstman, who's the CEO of 1Qubit quantum computing company, summed up our discussion today by saying, we are being hacked by the future at every moment, and the future is bright.
Thank you for this, and we'll come back to some of the other discussions in the cross-council format. But I'll try to use this as a transition to the panel here, because I like this point about this tension that you're describing about the bottom up and the top down. And if we turn to you, Vishal, you're chairing this council on artificial intelligence, and how hopeful are you that the technology is going to help us with building systems that are more inclusive, more participatory, more sustainable? And if so, what is needed, right, building on this?
Well, I am an optimist, and of course, there is no other alternative. We had 2 intense days of discussion on AI and robotics, and beyond that, when you look around, walking around the future councils in the morning, you get a tremendous sense of hope, a lot of urgency, a lot of desire to learn. I happened to walk by the panel that Benny was coordinating in the morning, and there is a tremendous need for understanding what is going on with this whole AI thing and so forth. And frankly, I find also that there is a lot of work that we need to do to make people aware and educate people on what it is. See, the reality is that the world around us is being reshaped by technology, by computing technology, in a very fundamental, irrevocable way and an ever-accelerating way. The pace of change that we have now is the fastest that it has ever been, and likely the slowest that it will ever be going forward. Therefore, we have to change the way that we approach the future, our planning for the future, and so forth. And one of the biggest issues that I see is in our ability to educate ourselves. So we thought about AI from the perspective of education, from the perspective of ethics and values, from the perspective of policies and governance, business strategies for CEOs and things like this, and are really excited over the next 2 years to take this incredibly important area and help shape the discourse around that.
Right, so an interesting argument here about both of you mirror this point about education, right? Maybe just very, very briefly going back to you, Justine, because you made that point as well, understanding the potential of a technology like quantum computing. Could you just in one sentence really tell us what the promise of quantum computing could bring us for solving some of the bigger challenges, sustainability, inclusion, and participation?
Probably not in one sentence. It's taken us 2 days. But that's just one of the future modes of computing that we talked about. But certainly quantum computing allows us to do a lot more with a lot less computer. And so, for example, problems that need huge supercomputers that only very wealthy countries and super wealthy individuals can afford will be, we hope in the future, possible to be solved by individuals who own one small laptop and perhaps one day a quantum phone.
Right. So about the scale and accessibility of these technologies. And so that brings me to you, Usha. You, with your financial background, but working in the environmental space, focusing on water, from where you sit, is that then really only about allocating capital in the best way to unleash these technologies and make progress? Or how do you look at sort of your theory of change from where you sit and your work with the Environment Council?
Thank you, Stephan. We had very interesting conversations over the last 2 days, and you're right. What we discussed was really the fact that we're talking about very big issues when it comes to environment and natural resources, really big issues, planetary boundaries, and what have you. And when you really think about those and you think about what has been done on it so far, what has been done is necessary but not sufficient. And what has been done? Large international accords, multilateral agreements, a lot of thinking, a lot of papers, a lot of discussions. And now when we look at it going forward in the future, we have to ask ourselves the question, okay, how do we accelerate this? And I'm going to pick up on something Bani said yesterday. We are looking at non-linear problems almost with linear solutions. So how do we accelerate it? And one big accelerator that we discussed over the last 2 days really is the use of technology and technological models, whether it's the quantum phone or anything else, right? And when you use technology, we also discussed the fact that you have to use it within a values framework. You have to worry about how you're doing this, why you're doing it. Just because you have a new technology, if that technology solves one thing and pollutes the other, you have to be sure of the ramifications of using technologies and how you use them. From a finance point of view, acceleration through technology brings it from the high macro level actually down to the user level. And one of the users are the finance people like me. I need to understand the solutions more clearly, more simply, in order to be able to put finance behind it. As long as it remains intractable, it becomes very difficult to put finance behind it. So technology, I'm as optimistic as you, Vishal, technology has the potential to open up what has become almost a closed system of worrying about the future. Maybe if we open it up to others, we will find ourselves on a better solutions path.
Right. So welcoming the education effort that your council is going to undertake, particularly for also the financial sector to understand. But going back to you, Vishal, I mean, in terms of the, not just the potential, but also dealing with some of the potential risks in these technologies, what were some of the key principles that you discussed in your council about mitigating those or establishing a framework that would allow us to really seize these benefits that you're describing?
So when we think about the embrace of incredibly complex, powerful technologies like AI and robotics, we identified a whole bunch of risks, different categories of risk, different kinds of risks that we need to think about. The way we are approaching this, I mean, it's an amazing panel, amazing council of 20 or so incredibly diverse and distinguished people with experience in AI. The way we organized our own thoughts was education, health, ethics and values, and the jobs. These are 4 important dimensions that are impacted by AI and robotics. And then, of course, a whole bunch of others we just bucketed into another category. And for each of these, we thought about the opportunities that these technologies enable for us, the risks that they enable for us, and the recommendations that our council comes up with. We'll share this, of course, the first wave of this in Davos when we are ready. But the important thing is risks are an integral part of thinking about every dimension of how this technology will shape our future. The risks can range from risks around unmitigated use of these systems, around asymmetry of information and access to these systems, around the ability of these systems to influence us and shape our thinking around them and so forth. So some very deep and profound risks that show up. How do we create standards around it? what are some of the examples of standards that have worked in the past that we could leverage, given that these are incredibly dynamic and powerful systems. So a diverse and multi-perspective articulation of these aspects like risks is essential early enough that we are able to, that we'll be able to deal with this. One exercise that we tried, because the purpose of the Futures Council is to look at 2030, 14 years out, one exercise that we tried was how, imagine that we are in 2030 and we look backwards over the last 14 years, what are the things that we have achieved? What are the things that we want to ensure that are not risks by that time? What are the capabilities that we want to ensure that we have already achieved? So we went through this exercise of, it would be ridiculous if we did not have this figured out by 2030, and things of this nature. So I think that the more we think about AI, look, in the end, what it comes down to is technologies like AI and robotics are ways to solve problems that have been well-defined, that have been mechanically articulated. The human frontier is in defining these problems, in articulating the next problems that are in front of us. So what better opportunity than now for all of us to bring our perspectives together and shape these problems, shape these futures so that we may end up developing these technologies for our benefit rather than our destruction.
Right. Now, we talked about the complex interaction that might have in society. There's, of course, systems that might develop unintended consequences, emergent behaviors in the confluence of different technologies, in the confluence of societies. I wanted to turn back to David Krakauer, who also was leading one of these cross-council sessions on the impact of biotechnologies, I believe. And so from where you're coming from, as president of the Santa Fe Institute, and as you're hearing Vishal and sort of that the plead for shaping an environment in which these technologies can have the most positive impact. How are you looking at that in terms of the functioning of that system and in terms of what you discussed earlier in the context of biotechnologies?
Yeah, so we had a wonderful animated argument conversation in our group, and one of the things that comes up in lieu of your remarks is we're experiencing this interesting reciprocal dynamic. We're taking an organismal technology, intelligence, and moving it out into the world, into machines. And we're taking a technology and moving it into organisms, that is genetic engineering. And in both cases, one of the threats that we perceived was forfeiting understanding. So in the case of AI, huge data sets informing very large machine learning algorithms that are predictive but incomprehensible. And the other way around, multifactorial genetic disorders that we're in some sense addressing with CRISPR-Cas9-like technologies, but there are so many factors that there's no hope of understanding the basic genetic mechanisms. So the future, one of the challenges for the future is the absence or forfeiting of human explanation and understanding. And that, of course, has ethical implications. We discussed genetic nationalism, the fact that, you know, the heterogeneity in economic prosperity derives in large measure from the heterogeneity of the distribution of resources. But that's true in genetics, and there will be nations that will say, no, that gene comes from a species found in the Amazon, we own it. And will it be possible to enforce? How will we share that basic information across the entire planet? Or will we discover a new form of inequality that will emerge out of the genetic space? And finally, I think a very interesting ethical question was raised. How is this technology different from any other technology in the history of civilization? And the point is that this is a direct intervention into the nature of being human, with implications on our descendants that will be unintended. And so the responsibilities in this case are rather unique, because we're changing biology, we're redirecting the course of evolution. It's a complex systems, and humans are notoriously bad at predicting the future of complex systems. So all sorts of complex ethical implications came out of our discussions.
Right, thank you. And I mean, Usha, you were saying that that understanding from the financial sector is key. Is that understanding of that complexity as we're seeing flows of capital into some of these technologies. Do you think that's a concern in terms of educating investors and the providers of capital?
It is. I think that when it comes to providers of capital or providers of debt, I think clarity and simplicity are really, really important factors. So when I listened to the gentleman who was just speaking about the complexity between matching technologies to human behavior even, that's all very, very important, but at the end of the day, it has to be framed into something that can be financed, that can be actioned, that can be implemented in the world. What does that contain? What are the components of a prototype that a financier like me would look at, right? Sure, technology is going to be part of it, but along with technology or innovation, as I tend to think of it, is the business model, the commercial model around what we're talking about. You were talking about the Amazon, sir, and we did too in our panel, because one of our panelists is very deep into the subject of the Amazon, and one of the things we picked up was the behavior of ants, as it turns out, and the behavior of ants and the impact it has on automobile movements, on driverless cars and so on and so forth. So we talked about that, and it came to us that one thing is technology influencing what we want to achieve. It's also what we want to achieve, influencing technology and how it puts out what the potential and what the actions are out there. So I think when you put those two together, it becomes something real, something doable, and something financial and financeable to somebody like me.
Right. So making it a concrete product in a way that can be understood. Jane Burson, you are also in a sustainability field on the Council on Energy, but you are leading a discussion on leveraging space technologies. Does that discussion resonate? And what was your main takeaway from that discussion in terms of leveraging those technologies for improving outcomes in terms of sustainability?
Thanks, Stephan. Well, actually, we started being a group of not the usual suspects, mostly people who didn't work in the space sector. From a very environmental standpoint, we started thinking about the concept of the global commons and how actually now the space sector is having to think about space as a global commons. I think the sector was previously characterized by a small handful of space agencies, very well funded, sticking to a well-defined set of rules with large investments. And actually it's completely changed now. There's commercial satellites, there's new space agencies from a range of developing countries. And we heard from Ellen Stephan, the chief scientist at NASA, that even an elementary school in the US has managed to build and launch its own CubeSat. So the rules of the game have completely changed. And in fact, there really aren't any rules of the game because governance in this way hasn't been required before. So the main takeaway for me was that there's a huge challenge there of creating a governance system where previously none was required in a sector that, like others, is moving very quickly. But then there's also a huge opportunity, particularly for things like climate change. There's huge amounts of data that we can access for climate resilience, and we need to make sure that they're accessible, the information is accessible to those at the bottom of the pyramid, so it's inclusive and sustainable development.
Thank you. And then if we take this sort of that potential and the potential of that, those technology, and if you look at that, Erica, from the perspective of the traditional international institutions that in a way are mandated for these imperatives that we talked about, the global responsibilities, what do you see as the most important challenges in terms of adapting those institutions to help facilitate this process?
Yeah, I think, for international institutions, but also for governments, it disrupts us to our core. The model under which we work is, changing dramatically. And I think that we are probably the last to catch up. And so I think there is a recognition and there is, innovation efforts within these organizations, but we're definitely grappling with it. I think from a human resourcing point of view, we can't afford to pay the same salaries that these, industries can pay. And so bringing that expertise in is actually quite difficult. And I think that there will need, that period of obviously education, but also translation between what's happening and the discussions that are in this room and the traditional institutions. I do think that there is a huge role for them to play in sort of the standard setting and the norms space, and I think that is where technologies can really turn to institutions to give them guidance around that. I think one of the things that all nation states have agreed to is the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And when we think about what we want our world to look like, if we don't implement, as you were saying, education, health, jobs, all of these are sort of rights. And if we don't implement them in our technologies by design, in the values that we're trying to build into these technologies, then we will create products and services and systems that are only designed for the haves of the world, leaving vast swaths of the world behind. And that's clearly not the world that we want to be in. So I think that focusing on how we can find shared interests and shared values with the financial sector, the technology sector, and corporates. So it's not a traditional CSR model anymore, or a charity model, which I think is not that useful. It's a where can we align ourselves so we're delivering value on the business side, but also on the social side.
Right.
And I think that organizations and institutions are aligning themselves to that, maybe slowly, but aligning themselves to that.
And how do you see that alignment of interest taking place? What are some of the mechanisms that you see in place working with industries or technologists like Vishal to facilitate that process?
Yeah, I think up till recently, all the technologies that were being developed or sort of put out into the world were being developed for the haves. And as more and more, as we think, like with the spread of, obviously mobile technology, we think about these new customers. They have, different needs. They don't need a laundry service app. They need a how do I get to school app. And I think that, the creators of technology need to have that empathy. And the only way to have that empathy is to design with the people that they're trying to provide these services for. So I think participation in that is key. Obviously it's hard, but I think that institutions are a good place to find that ability to participate and that bottom up.
Right. And on that word of participation, Tim, you are, as an organization with purpose, using technology to facilitate participation and engagement of large groups in society. How do you now, in this role with the Council on Platforms and Systems, how do you see that role as a sort of a facilitation for change through technology and engagement of citizens?
I think, one thing, we've got this sort of hybrid where we're looking at the platforms, the sort of new technology platforms especially, but also thinking about system thinking and system leadership. And I think that one of the reflections for us in these conversations this weekend have been how we all have a stake in the systems in which we operate. And many of those systems are under threat. Climate system, for example, social cohesion, even in many senses, the system of liberal international institutions that have existed since the Second World War are under threat in ways that haven't been the case, until now. And I think part of understanding that we have a stake in the systems in which we operate means that none of us can be free riders anymore. All of us have benefited from the community's investment in infrastructure, in educated workforces, in all the networks and institutions that exist and enable us to do what we do. And so one consequence of that is understanding that in this interdependent world, we can no longer purely aim to succeed ourselves at the expense of others. In an interdependent world, the failure of others, the failure of the system will be the failure of us ourselves. One consequence of that we have to ask in the context of our own organisations, how do we develop people who think systemically, who think at that system leadership level? I know from my experience here, working in government, working in a Prime Minister's office, I was always struck by you'd get leaders of organisations, CEOs of businesses who'd come in and they'd talk to a Prime Minister with a lack of empathy that government is very different from running a corporation. Likewise, it's very different to be the head of a regulatory agency, to be a researcher, to be in the academy, to be in media. But all of these pieces, they're all parts of the system. I think one aspect of what we need to do is to reflect on how we build system thinkers and system leaders who have the capacity, when they're on one side of the table, to understand the experience and perspective of people on the other side of the table. Now, you don't have to necessarily have to have lived the life of the person on the other side of the table, although I think it's great if you have. But it requires a greater act of imagination if you haven't. What we do need, though, in addressing the very significant systemic threats that we now face is that system thinking. And I think part of our work in thinking across all of the work of the different councils is that question of how do we build systemic thinking and systemic leadership.
Right. Vishal, does that tension that Tim is describing worry you from the perspective of the private sector and looking at government and institutions? Is that a concern from where you sit? Or?
Yeah, it does. And it does for a very fundamental reason. Perhaps a different perspective on it, but it does for a very fundamental reason. If we look at the impact, if you look at jobs, for example, if you look at the impact of automation or AI on jobs, there is an extreme view which is also a realistic view that with AI now we are facing a situation where our mental capabilities are no longer going to be enough kind of a situation. But if we keep that aside for a second and just look at in the near term, the nature of jobs and how AI technology will shape the nature of jobs, we have a very conceptually straightforward equation that as jobs get displaced by AI, there is clearly a sense that new technologies are creating new kinds of jobs. So we have a quote-unquote simple problem of reskilling the workforce in achieving those skills that are necessary for the new kinds of jobs that are being created. So far, it is easier said than done. In order to make this kind of a thing happen, a whole bunch of forces have to come together. The companies which are going to need these. I was just reading as I was on my way here from California that in AWS, in Amazon Web Services, there are 4,800 open positions, and they have difficulty filling these positions. There are more than 10 million jobs, computing-oriented jobs, open in the United States. So it is not that there is a shortage of jobs. There are jobs that get displaced in very fundamental ways. In my own industry, they do, for example. But we don't have adequate ways of developing the skills necessary for the new kinds of jobs fast enough. So who is going to do this? And when we think about something like this, a collaborative endeavor between exactly what Tim is talking about, between the public sector, the private sector, the government, the institutions, the universities, they have to come together to solve a problem like this. The rate at which new kinds of jobs are going to be needed and the kinds of technical complexity that these will require is accelerating. So this gap between people's ability to reskill themselves for the jobs of tomorrow is increasing. So we need to solve this problem. So one of the things that we in our panel thought about and that we will work in more detail on in the next couple of months is how might we create a situation where by 2030 there is a universally available set of opportunities to reskill people using the very same technologies and how various organizations can come together to achieve that objective. It should be possible if we all collectively put our minds to it. There is no reason why by 2030 everybody in the world does not have access to the ability to teach themselves the kinds of things that are necessary. There is no reason why the kinds of education that is necessary for a sort of one of our sub-teams came up with this phrase of bespoke reskilling is not something that is available as a commodity for all of us. So these kinds of things have to be thought about. And I think instead of creating a artificially forced collaboration between public and private sector and so forth, if we aim our sights on some of these really fundamental problems that need to be solved, I think there is a better chance of these forces aligning themselves.
Excellent. Erika wanted to come in, but I also wonder if there's anyone from the Council on Education, Gender and Work, as you're describing this need for skilling. But let me turn to Erika first.
Yeah, just a point on education, because I think you kind of need to talk about that also with reskilling. I mean, you look at the Middle East, North Africa region, youth unemployment is through the roof, and there is a huge, you look at these countries that are having very large youth population growth, right? Europe and the U.S. essentially is that we're contracting. If you can't provide the quality, we're not even be able to provide access. So, and we're still thinking about what quality means, and I think we're thinking about it in a very traditional sense, right? Like curriculum that as we know it from 30 years, 50 years ago. And I think there needs to be a huge rethinking of, what are the skills that young people are going to need when they hit the workforce as well. And I would hope that, we can see some leadership in that space that is not just from the public sector, but also from the private sector as well.
Is there anyone in the audience from the Future of Education, Gender and Work to bring in that discussion from that council? In the front, to the left, please.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity. We are very much connected to what you have been discussing, and especially, joining the sessions on artificial intelligence, robotics, computing, and other stuff. We have been discussing the reskilling of the workforce and the responsibility of the corporations in this, in conjunction, of course, with the governments, and the impact on the education system, and what does it mean in terms of edtech, and how can we have lifelong learning and adult learning. So that's going to be one of the focus areas, I think, a new dialogue series. And another topic was also the impact of technology in the labor markets, but new labor markets also, because as developed markets losing jobs, developing markets, some of them will have new jobs. So what kind of jobs will they be? Will they be leapfrogging to the new world? And most probably yes. So how are we going to prepare our youth for those jobs? I think that's the scope of our discussion, and also the STEM skills. There is also the gender dimension in that, of course. How do we get more STEM skills for female, for the girls, to prepare them for the future?
Just one thing to add on this education piece. I think this is a great example of a system-level challenge, because in most developed countries, around about a quarter of the workforce people coming out of schooling are essentially falling out of schooling, not finishing school. They don't have the prospects that once existed because the manual jobs aren't there. Now, interestingly, I've come into this in the last year doing a whole lot of public opinion research across Europe on the causes of xenophobia, and it's like connected to why you've got populations shifting to these dangerous far-right parties and embracing sort of the racist and xenophobic rhetoric. But it's actually like a big factor there is they've just kind of been left behind by the education system. And it's not an easy thing to solve, because often the way that our funding for education, in the US especially, it's directly related to local, essentially local income sources. And so the poorest kids are in the poorest areas with the worst resources, when actually they need the most resources. So these are system-level challenges that are really significant and will require more than just governments at any level to solve.
Excellent. So, Usha, did you want to comment on that? Is that?
Well, just to say the following, that look, I mean, I think systems level thinking is very, 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 very important. I agree with that, but what kind of systems, right? So when Vishal was talking, or when we're talking about education and so on and so forth, I think change and progress, if you will, especially if we're talking about leapfrogging, Stephan, in any way at all, needs a different view towards that change. In other words, there's still the element of buy-in in many, many parts of the world and many, many parts of a given economy in terms of what the future is supposed to look like, right? And part of that buy-in has not been obtained in many ways because there is an asymmetry of information that you were talking about. Not everyone has the access to the kind of information that some people do. So in my mind at least, the theory of change, as we were talking earlier, and progress has to incorporate the taking away some of the obstacles, such as asymmetry of change, and then bringing in place aspects such as reskilling in terms of education, or changing the DNA of international organizations, or whatever it is that we're talking about. I think technology can be a great accelerator of removing some of those obvious obstacles that we don't think about. If you think of change, reform, and leapfrogging, boring stuff like infrastructure, finance, and information access are the back office of that change. And we can't forget that in our excitement at bringing in AI to solve this and so on, because AI and computing needs energy and electricity, and if you don't have that, then you're not going to be able to participate in that technological revolution.
And that buy-in that Usha is talking about, Tim, in terms of your approach to actually using technology to build movements or sustain movements, is that an element of the equation you would say in what Usha is highlighting here?
Yeah, and the technology platforms obviously are being built often for one purpose, but they can be used for others as well. So I mean, you see in social movement building is seeing amazing entrepreneurialism coming up from any number of different areas. One good example of some recent work is Airbnb, which has got this sort of platform of millions of hosts and guests, and they've set up a humanitarian lab where they're asking how can we use our platform for good, because they know a lot of their hosts want to contribute to good in the world. In the refugee crisis, you have a particular problem when you have resettlement of refugees into cities, that they arrive and for the first month or so often there's a gap where they don't have permanent accommodation. Hey presto, this is a moment when the host community of Airbnb can fill that gap. And the Canadian private sponsorship scheme for refugees, which was mentioned on the panel yesterday, has demonstrated that when refugees arrive in a city, having personal connections, human connections, tapping into networks, has a huge effect on whether they successfully settle and integrate or struggle in the first period. Being able to arrive in a city and be welcomed into someone's home and be there and have that connection is very powerful. So Airbnb is looking at their role in facilitating that. And I think that's a great example where, I mean, we know from our research there's a great hunger on the part of millions of people across the world to play a part in solving big problems like the refugee crisis. 24% of people across Europe say they would like to do more, they don't know what to do. And this is an example where you've got a technology platform that's already there and can really have a significant impact and can be an incredibly enriching experience for the hosts, as well as obviously giving a welcome to the refugees.
Right. So I want to transition a little bit into what role the councils might play and your respective roles in this. But before I do that, I wanted to see if there was anyone else from other councils that wanted to come in on this question of technology as a facilitator for transformative change and some of the elements that are required to achieve that. Bani.
One of the other points that came up both in today's session on AI and robotics, as well as the 3D printing, is the way in which that our decision models about what constitutes a standard or a quality, etc., is going to be contested by a very, very tight feedback loop and the ability to iterate very, very quickly in a dynamic state and learn and go down different paths and be much more context aware, but also bring back a whole lot of information in order to pose decisions in those different frames. So for example, in the 3D printing world, there was a very lively discussion about how one of the weaknesses of that at least the perceived weakness right now is that 3D printed objects are less durable than, say, injection molded materials, etc. And so how do you maintain the quality of parts? And what would you have if you have manufacturing that is hugely distributed, which incidentally is a huge advantage. You're crossing the distribution chasm and being able to manufacture in localized ways, etc. But what would you have if you have, let's say, an airplane part where you don't know exactly how it's going to perform? And then the discussion took a turn where saying, okay, now if we look at these technologies and then mesh them with sensing technologies and tight iteration, can you actually, instead of standardizing a performance for every part, going because you don't want to avoid that one failure, can you sense when it's going to be able to, it's nearing failure, and can you actually look at what context it's failing in so that it can modify itself to be better in that context? So very, very different way in looking at very established systems.
So.
Thanks very much. My name is Conrad, and I was part of the and I am still part of the Biotech Futures Council, and I wanted to supplement the term of responsibility that was already brought up by the panel and say that in addition to doing the right thing when it comes to responsibility, I think all of us promoting various technologies have to also focus on earning trust for those. And doing the right thing in and of itself may not earn us the trust that is needed to succeed. Thank you.
So how do we earn the trust? Was there a conclusion to that? Or
who am I to
does anyone else have a
say that?
Hillary in the back, if I see.
Yes, there's a very interesting quote from a lady in the UK called Baroness Honora O'Neill, who says, "The plaintive question about how to build trust is resonating. The answer is really simple. You build trustworthiness, and then you give good evidence of how you are trustworthy." And I think that's one of the really interesting aspects of the fourth industrial revolution is the trustworthiness of these technologies. And obviously that whole issue of trustworthiness incorporates so many of those things we've been discussed today. But I think if we focus on trustworthiness instead of trust, we start in a wholly different place. So I'd like to urge us to sort of maybe have that mental model of trustworthiness in our mind rather than the slightly communications-led model of how do we get these people to trust us? Because that sends us in a different direction.
Vishal, trustworthiness of AI, is that how you look at it as well?
Yeah, this is a question that we wrestle with and we expect to continue to wrestle with for a while. Stuart Russell, who is a professor at University of California, Berkeley, he actually serves on many such groups. I don't know if he's here in the audience. There he is. A lot of Stuart and a lot of us thought about this matter of building trustworthiness into these systems and so forth. It is not straightforward. We don't have good mechanisms of articulating things because circumstances that these kinds of systems can be exposed to are too many to foreshadow, to foresee. Stuart, perhaps you want to add something to this when I'm done. So trustworthiness and building frameworks for ensuring the trustworthiness of these systems is one of the key things. But the thing about these dynamic technologies is that our notions of trust, our notions of experience, and the kinds of incidents of breach of trust that have happened are all inevitably based on the past, of things that we already know about, things that we can articulate. And as these technologies take us into the unknown, into the unprecedented kinds of areas, which we don't even have a vocabulary for yet, it is difficult to articulate trust for those kinds of unanticipated situations. Right. So we have to somehow develop the foresights for the kinds of consequences that we want and the kinds of consequences that we don't want to be able to build these into the system. And innovative ways of dealing with this would involve attaching a human factor to many of these, or a human council, or a bottom-up groundswell kind of a mechanism to determine trust in intelligent systems, so that it is not just an intelligent system operating by itself, but it is a human body, a human organization that is somehow responsible for ensuring the integrity of that system. Stuart, you want to add something to this?
One more quick sentence on this trust question, Stuart, if you want.
Yeah, so the way we build intelligent systems is essentially, for them to be useful to us, we have to be able to give them objectives and have them figure out how to achieve the objectives. Otherwise, we might as well do it ourselves. And the difficulty with giving objectives to machines, as King Midas found out, is that once you give the objective, if you give the wrong one, you have a problem. So we've actually been developing a technical theory, we're probably going to call it humble systems, that know that they don't know what the true human objective is. And you can actually prove that when you design systems that way, they are guaranteed to be beneficial, because until they understand well enough what you want, they won't do anything. And that turns out to be a much more trustworthy way to do things.
Yes.
So humility into artificial intelligence. That's Bryce, you wanted to come in? Please, go ahead.
Thanks. So I just wanted to make a little push for the core insights that emerged out of the Health Council, the Health and Healthcare Council. After a lot of debate, it ended up being the case that at the very core of a lot of the discussion that we are having about transformation is behavior change. How do we change the behaviors of human systems, starting from the individual, across the community, to systems, and then partnerships? And behavior change is fundamental, because at the end of the day, if we want to look into the future, it cannot be about the status quo. There definitely has to be a commitment to serious transformation, starting with values. We have to decide what is it that we want to see for the world, what is it that we want to appreciate, what is it that we want to value, and then the behavior change can have a technological direction. It can't be just behavior change for nothing. Now, the way of looking at it from concentric-centric perspective of saying, okay, individual changes then accumulate over time, and then you get a trigger, is to understand that that technological direction cannot come without a deep and profound understanding of values. So that was very critical. Then we realized that the feedback loops that come out of that kind of process enable intelligent systems that have values as well. So you can have values programmed into these kind of systems when you recognize that fundamental point. And I think that is very critical. Also to the trust question.
Right. Erica.
Yeah, just to sort of expand a little bit on that point, I totally agree with you. And I think that, there's values, but then there's also, as Mike Posner, my co-chair, was saying, there's standards. And the standards, even if it's not like you haven't met the standards, it's not that. It's standards that we all want to achieve, right? Which are, we want all of our children to be healthy, to have an education, and we call those values, but if you don't measure them as standards and build them implicitly into technology, they won't happen. And I think we've seen that, through the past. And also just on a point of AI, which is kind of related, that came up today in the AI and robotics discussion was, it's based on data that you have, right? That's how machines learn, or that's my understanding at least. And if you don't have enough data from, or you don't have the right kind of data from people who are traditionally left out, then they won't be included in, the decisions that these machines make. So I think it's, also related to that point.
Usha.
Stephan, I just wanted to say that, in our council, the Environment Council, when we were talking about this issue of trust, and the issue of trust as we go into what is essentially an unknown or relatively unknown future, some of the things we were talking about is that it's really important for this change and whether using technologies to be inclusive on a couple of levels. One, people have to have access to that information, as I said earlier. Second, they have to have some participation in the decision making. And so when we were talking about using technology in some of the areas of environment, say water, okay? Water rights are becoming one of the biggest issues as you go forward, and as an issue that the world has to grapple with. And in order to make that transition easier, if you use blockchain, we talked about it, I'm no expert on this, but if we use blockchain as a technology to disseminate information and also allow people to participate in decision-making around water rights in order to safeguard water resources, that might be something very, very interesting. So when you really think about what does trust mean, I hear you on trustworthiness, absolutely. But what do you do to do that? From my perspective, it's around information equality and decision-making participation. I'm not going to call it equality.
Right. Just because you mention it, is there someone in the audience that could, in one sentence, narrow down the role of blockchain in this trust discussion? Because there was also this future lab on the blockchain.
Oh.
Hi, my name is Santiago Siri. I participated in the Future Council of the Environment and Resource Security. And blockchain is an innovation that appears on an academic paper in 2009, authored by Satoshi Nakamoto, who is a pseudonym. Nobody knows really who is the physical identity behind this idea, precisely because it's an idea about decentralization of authority. That's the main innovation that blockchains proposed. The idea of being able to operate in decentralized networks, to generate transactions in decentralized networks without having a central entity or a central authority validating the transactions. So it's a notion of permissionless access to the possibility of to start using this kind of technology, not only for financial transactions as Bitcoin is being used, and I would seriously argue that pay attention to Bitcoin because it's the reward in the system that secures the cryptographic capability of the network, and that means the security of the network and the reliability and the trust that are a consequence of such security. And
thank you. So we take the point. Sorry for being. We only have a couple of minutes left. So the point of decentralization, the point of humility that was made earlier, the point on education that was really at the forefront of what we discussed. In the final minutes, really, your one thought on what should be the key priority for the councils going forward. We're at the beginning of this 2-year term, and having synthesized some of these key questions that emerged from our 2 days, what would you say, literally, in one word, as the key priority for the councils going forward? Vishal.
The thing about future that I always took to heart is that our brains are somehow programmed to think of the future as an increment of the present, and yet we know that this does not have to be the case. The future is something that we can shape to be the way that we can do, that we can make, that we can imagine, that we can create. And I think that here, with all these global future councils, there is a tremendous opportunity to make the kinds of futures that we would wish to live in, instead of simply assuming that somehow there are these forces that will inevitably make the kinds of futures that we will be forced to accept. So I think if we take that constructive view, literally constructive view, we'll be better off.
Thank you. Usha.
So not just one word, right? So I loved what you said about the future not being an increment of today. Having said that, I think as councils, the best thing we can do over the next 2-year period is to connect with each other, because there's so much talent. And so I'm no expert on blockchain, but somebody is, certainly not on AI. And in connecting to create a system of thinking and to create something which is not thought of in silos, but in systems and horizontally.
Thank you. Erica.
I mean, I'm slightly biased from this angle, but I think it's including the values, the standards, and the rights that we want to see into these technologies and figuring out how to make sure that it's not just an afterthought, but it's something that also drives the commercial success of them as well.
Right. Thank you. Tim?
I think a number of us had this experience yesterday of sitting around looking at each other and asking ourselves in our groups, what's the problem that we're here to solve? And I think one piece of advice for us would be, let's capture the real problems that we need to solve. Maybe we need to find another way just to capture those so that they're thrown out as problems for the community to work on. And I think the most fundamental problems, you know, we talk about technology, we talk about climate, but the most fundamental problems we have are the problems of human problems of us coexisting in open, inclusive societies and working out how we do our work together to solve that most fundamental human problem. I think that's a great mission for us to take on for the next 2 years.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel.